Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and welcome to another episode of the Lost Railways of Yorkshire. And this time we're going to be looking at the railway at the end of the earth, the Spurn military railway, all the way out on Spurn Point. Spurn Point is a bit of a weird place, it has to be said. I've been here many times since I was a kid, and every time I always get the distinct feeling that nature doesn't want me here. This is somewhere I shouldn't be. When you're on the point, you're surrounded by water on three sides. You've got the North Sea to the east and the Humber to the west and the south. And even here, at the start of it, I've got a 3.5 mile walk to get to the point, surrounded on both sides by the pounding waves of the North Sea and the deceptively calm Humber, its relatively still face belying the dangerous riptides under its surface. And this itself, Spurn, this peninsula, is nothing more than a sandbank formed by geological processes. Basically what happens is the crumbling and very quickly eroding Holderness coast is made of boulder clay. And that boulder clay gets washed along the coast by the sea in a process known as coastal flow, where the sea hits a coastline and then kind of runs down along it. And it carries all of that detritus that it's carved off of the cliff sides with it, and all the sand and all the pebbles, until it hits an opposing flow, in this case, the Humber. And you get a big eddy, and all that heavy material starts to sink to the bottom, where it gradually, over the process of hundreds of years, mounts up into a peninsula. Now the problem with that is that because the Holderness coast is eroding so quickly, it's basically moving westwards at quite a high rate, which means that Spurn kind of eventually gets left out on a limb, and it's no longer in that little calm zone between the Humber and the North Sea, and it gets washed away, broken apart, turned into a string of islands, and finally disappears, only for the process to begin again slightly further to the west, where the coastal flow eddy zone now is. And that's happened loads of times over the last few hundred years. Which begs the question, why would you build anything here, let alone a railway? Well, for the building anything part, you've got to go back a few hundred years. So to answer that question of why you would ever build anything here on Spurn if it's such a problem to do so with its temporary nature, the answer lies in the importance of the Humber as a shipping route. Ever since the 13th century, when the monks at Mews founded the town of Wycombe Hull, this has been a major international shipping route. And the Spurn Peninsula, as a strip of land that just dangles into the mouth of the Humber, represents a serious navigational hazard. And ship's captains need to be able to know where that is so they don't run aground on it. Hence, lighthouses. They were the first thing that needed to be built on this bit of land. And there's been a permanent lighthouse here since the 17th century, although the earliest known lighthouse was actually built in the 15th century by a hermit, of all people. History doesn't record what happened to that one, but presumably given the cyclical nature of Spurn, it probably a few hundred yards off the coast. But since the 17th century, there has been a permanent lighthouse presence here. The one built in the 17th century finally met its end towards the end of the 18th, early 19th centuries, where it was replaced by another one built just a bit further along. And that one was built with a huge circular wall surrounding the base of it to help protect it against the tides. Now, when that lighthouse started to develop cracks, another one was built in the 19th century, and that is this one that stands behind me today. That was built towards the end of the 19th century, and it's still standing solid now. The old lighthouse's wall, however, remained even after the lighthouse itself had been demolished, and it was actually used as a kind of compound to build lighthouse keepers' houses, and their families would live inside that little sheltered enclave for years and years. In fact, right up until the demolition of all these things in the 60s and 70s. But, of course, as with all things, the lighthouse became redundant when ships started having their own built-in radar and GPS positioning. And this one has been defunct for decades. However, you can still get guided tours around it, so worth thinking about.
The other lighthouse you can see on Spurn is the Low Light, which dates from around 1852. Originally, you see, lighthouses came in pairs with a high light and a low light to allow captains to see how close they were to the shore, but this practice fell out of use with various advances in lighthouse design, and this old building was used as a munition store and then later as a water tank, hence the rusting tank and pipes stuck on top of it to this day. The second reason that people built on Spurn was also related to the growing importance of the Humber as a shipping route. As the Industrial Revolution was exploding in its early days and the number of ships travelling into the Humber to reach Hull was increasing dramatically, so too were the number of ships that were getting caught out by the treacherous estuary in its hidden sandbanks and mudflats. Ships were being grounded, sunk and capsized, and Hull's dominant maritime power, Trinity House, decided that something needed to be done about that. A lifeboat station was built on Spurn Point in the early years of the 19th century, with the lifeboatmen and their families originally living in Kilnsea, but by 1819 this was deemed inadequate as their response time was far too slow. They had to travel by boat to get to the lifeboat itself. So Trinity House built a row of cottages on what was then Spurn Island in order to make the service faster and more efficient. And so the lifeboatmen and their families joined the lighthouse keepers and their families as the permanent residents of Spurn Island. Over the coming years, the original cottages kept getting flooded, and so a new set were built higher up on the point behind a reinforced bit of shore, and the neck of the peninsula would be built up and reinforced to avoid the regular sea washovers that had often reduced it to an island, as can be seen here on the 1853 Ordnance Survey map. This small community wasn't always alone, however. During the Napoleonic Wars of the opening years of the 19th century, a gun emplacement had been built here, as well as a barracks to house the soldiers who operated it, just in case the French had decided to invade England via the Humber. The old barracks was commandeered and repurposed by the lifeboat operators to serve as their boathouse after that war, when the peninsula was abandoned by the military. So by the start of the 20th century, Spurn had a tiny, quirky set of inhabitants. The lifeboatmen, the only full-time lifeboat crew in the country, lived in the cottages specially built for them and their families, and the lighthouse keepers lived in cottages surrounded by a round wall that was originally built to protect the previous lighthouse. There was a tiny school for their children, and a slightly larger cottage that served this minute community as an inn. The village of Kilnsea lay back on the mainland at the root of Spurn Point, but there was no road. If you wanted to head over that way, you faced a 3.5-mile walk over sand dunes, though preferably at low tide, as parts of the neck in the peninsula could still at times be flooded in high tide. Most of the inhabitants, however, would travel by boat if they ever wanted to visit the mainland, usually crossing the Humber to visit Grimsby and its thriving markets.
It must have been such a different way of life. Far from the bustle and the clank of the industrial city, or the hectic nature of the agricultural market towns. Just a handful of neighbours living alone on this tiny spit of land. Nothing but the sound of the wind and the sea, and the huge open sky above you. It must have been incredibly peaceful. But, of course, that wasn't to last, because in 1914, Britain joined the Great War, which, by the way, was anything but great. And it was deemed that this would be an excellent place to build a gun battery to defend the very, very important River Humber, a huge trade route, from naval attacks. You see, Britain felt dominant in the seas, but Germany's navy was up and coming, and it had another trick up its sleeve that the British were also very concerned about: air power.
The War Department came in on ships, moored on the calm Humber side of the peninsula, and built a long T-shaped jetty just south of the lifeboat slipway. The plan was to build 2 gun batteries. One would be called Green Battery on Spurn itself, and another called Godwin Battery at Kilnsea. The major concern of the War Department, however, was the crumbling nature of the coast around Kilnsea and the shifting, ephemeral nature of Spurn itself. In the 19th century, the erosion of the coast at Kilnsea had gotten so bad that the cemetery fell into the sea and bodies and coffins were being exposed along the cliff. The entire village had to effectively relocate further inland to avoid falling entirely into the sea. So to combat this, the War Department decided to build a seawall at Kilnsea and a series of groins up and down the neck of Spurn to stabilise and protect it from erosion. Building that seawall at Kilnsea, however, was going to be difficult. The ships could only bring in stone via the sea, landing it at Spurn Point, and there was no road to ferry the material to Kilnsea. And you might wonder why they didn't think to build a road instead. Surely that would be cheaper. But lorries in 1914 were nowhere near as reliable or powerful as they would become in later years. And by contrast, laying a railway track and commandeering locomotives and rolling stock would be a walk in the park. The railway was laid down using second-hand track, marked with either the Great Central Railway or the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway logos. Running all the way from Godwin Battery at Kilnsea, up past the lighthouse and the coastguard, and turning sharply west onto the new jetty, where the rails ran all the way to within just a few feet of the end, allowing goods to be loaded straight from waiting ships into the trucks by steam cranes. A locomotive workshop was built next to the lighthouse, and it was here that the line's eclectic collection of motive power would be cared for. During the war, there were 5 small steam locomotives stationed on the line, delivered by ship, all of them small, short wheelbase locos that had been designed specifically to handle tight curves of industrial railways and docks, and thus they were perfectly suited to the role that they were to play on Spurn. Of the 5 locos, 3 of them were smaller 040 saddle tanks named Lord Mayor, Francis and Somerton, and 2 were slightly bigger 060 locos named Bombay and Kenyon. After the war ended and the other locos went on to other roles, only Kenyon was left, partly due to a feeling that it was already on its last legs, and so it was allowed to simply run down and fall into gradual disrepair. Over the 1920s, Kenyon lost its side rods, which basically turned it from a 6-wheel drive to a 4-wheel drive. Its brake blocks were allowed to deteriorate, and finally the rear coupling rods were also removed late in its life, reducing its drive to just 2 wheels. Kenyon eventually met its end when a cylinder cracked in 1929, and it was herded to Kilnsea, where a Hessel Road scrap dealer came and cut it up where it stood, shipping the pieces on lorries back to Hull. Interestingly, Lord Mayor, one of the locos that served on the line during the war, is the only one that's still in existence today, and it's a static display in the Museum of Rail Travel in Ingro on the Keighley and Worth Valley Preservation Railway.
So these lines here would have led into the workshop, which was right here, and this was right where all of the rolling stock and all the engines and all the other motive power on this line would get looked after, maintained and modified. And steam locomotion wasn't the only type of motive power on the island. Oh no. With this being a War Department line, the standards were a little more lax than they were on the main lines of the rest of the country. And the locals, both the War Department and the lifeboat people, created their own unique and quirky methods of getting to and from, including a pair of sail bogies. These were basically a couple of railway axles attached to what I can only describe as a flat surface made of boards. No seats, nothing to hang on to, no brakes, but in the middle of that was a sail to power it up and down. As you can imagine, that was a dangerous method of transport. There was no such thing as safety regulations back in those days, or if there were, the people here didn't really care. I mean, the only brake on them was a log that you would basically push off the front and just hope it slowed you down enough to actually, stop. Naturally, with such an unsafety conscious design, there were incidents. Of course there were. In the First World War, a group of servicemen were busy getting completely sloshed at the Bluebell in Kilnsea and decided to take the sail car back, because why wouldn't you when you can barely stand? It makes complete sense in the days before anyone knew about drink driving. But this was worse than just drink driving. They were so hammered that they actually fell asleep while in motion, and only just woke up in time to avoid being smashed to pieces against Green Battery's gates. On another occasion, a newlywed couple were being ferried on the sail bogie up Spurn Point, when a freak gust of wind suddenly caught the sail, and the man controlling the bogie, who was a newcomer to the island and didn't really have a lot of experience on the thing, panicked and jumped off, leaving the stunned wedding party to also panic, and shortly thereafter they all jumped off too, except the bride, who was too scared to, because at this point it was going about 40 miles an hour. Naturally, after a brief hesitation, she did, but when she fell, she landed on rocks and lacerated her face, so not a particularly good wedding day. But the sail bogies weren't the only peculiar form of motive power on Spurn. During the First World War, there was an influx here of Royal Engineers, and they were here to oversee a lot of the construction work. And one of them, a Lieutenant Leese, brought with him an old pre-war Itala sports car, which he fitted with railway wheels. Because why wouldn't you? I mean, it seems obvious, really. But that sports car, zooming up and down the railway line between Kilnsea and Spurn, was actually quite the fixture. It became a solid part of the motive power on Spurn for the next 30 years, basically. It was still going strong in the Second World War. And by then it had lost its engine cover, it had lost its mudguards, its lights, its seats had been replaced by a big box of wood, and its radiator was replaced by some Heath Robinson contraption of a big tank there and a big tank behind it. But it was a useful part of the motive power. I mean, at one point it rescued a stricken steam engine. So, yeah, a bizarre thing, an old pre-First World War sports car that just zoomed up and down this strange, desolate place at the end of the earth. Brilliant.
The most common vehicles to grace the railway were, however, the petrol-driven railcars, of which several served on the line. These were basically nothing more than simple carriages fitted with railway wheels that could be driven up and down the line, much like the Bitzer but with more seating. The early Drury cars that served from 1919 until the late 1920s were boxy and not overly reliable. The Hardy railcar that replaced them was itself not exactly a robust beast either, eventually stripping the motor on one of its axles and meeting a grisly end when an unfortunate driver forgot to drain the coolant system one particularly freezing night in 1940, and the whole engine block cracked. The railcar that stayed the distance was the Hudswell Clarke model, which arrived in 1933 and lasted until the closure of the line in 1951, being sold on afterwards to be used as a runner truck in Bicester until at least the early 1970s.
And if you wanted a graphic example of just how quickly Spurn Point is changing shape, 70 years ago in 1951, this was a complete railway line from end to finish, all the way from Kilnsea up to Spurn Point in the distance there. Now, this section of it here that cuts across the concrete road that was built during the Second World War heads off into, well, rubble and a beach. And that's happened within living memory for some people. The awesome destructive power of nature trying to take Spurn Point back. So, this might not look like much today, but in the First World War, this was the nerve centre of all of the Humber Coast defence. This was the port war signal station. It would collate reports from all over the coastal defences, including, of course, Godwin Battery at Kilnsea and Green Battery here on Spurn. And it monitored all of the shipping traffic that would go into the Humber. If a ship came through that hadn't communicated and hadn't got the OK from this place, that ship was in trouble. I mean, it was wartime. Do I really need to spell out what might happen? And so, as we get closer to the end of the line, here at Spurn Point, we find ourselves coming up to the gates of Green Battery, or Spurn Fort as it later became known. And if you were beyond those points and you weren't a War Department personnel or one of the contractors, you were in big trouble, matey. Even the lifeboatmen were generally not permitted beyond this point. They lived here in a row of cottages that had been built in the 19th century for them on the seafront here, which actually is still a fairly decent position, but the defences just beyond there are starting to look a little worse for wear, so they were demolished and replaced with much more modern double glazed centrally heated ones further up. But this marks the point where our railway line is almost at its destination. So now we are exactly pretty much at the end of the line for the Spurn Military Railway, because here, amongst the remains of Green Battery, which are still standing in stark contrast to all of the remains tumbled into the sea at Kilnsea of Godwin, we come finally to the jetty, first constructed during the First World War, strengthened in the 1930s, and still in use today as a lifeboat launch. But the railway used to go all the way to the end of this jetty, literally right up to the very end, and there was a steam crane there. That steam crane would enable direct loading of stuff from ships into trucks, and the trucks would then run it all the way back up there to Kilnsea to help with the construction of the seawall.
Godwin, however, did not fare quite so well. The remains of Godwin Battery today are scattered across the ever-decreasing beach at Kilnsea, a stark reminder of just how fast this coastline is crumbling into the sea. It was only 70 years ago that these structures still stood on the land, rather than being tipped unceremoniously onto the beach, as if a giant box of half-built Lego had been upended here.
So there is one part of Godwin Battery that hasn't actually crumbled off the cliff and fallen into the sea. That's because it wasn't built anywhere near the sea to start with. A few hundred yards inland, standing in a field, is this. And it's a sound mirror, built in the First World War, What this is an early form of early warning system, similar to what we have now with radar, except much shorter ranged and using sound instead of radar. The bowl shape of the whole thing was designed to focus sound coming in off the sea into a point just above that tube that's sticking up out the ground, on top of which would have been a kind of a horn, listening horn, rather like a gramophone horn, only in reverse for sound for listening rather than to come out. And at the other end of the tube would be a guy sitting there listening to it, waiting to hear the telltale drone of a Zeppelin's engines. Because the Germans were using Zeppelins, the airships, to come across to Britain and drop bombs on our cities, including Hull, which had the city centre bombed on numerous occasions by them. It wasn't much, but they gave 4 minutes early warning, and that was often enough to give people time to prepare and save lives. Brilliant and ingenious piece of engineering. In later years it was still used before radar. It was used again in the Second World War to hear the impending sound of bombers, only at that point they'd advanced to the point where they were putting microphones on top of the tube rather than just an old-fashioned listening horn. Wasn't in service long in World War II until they discovered radar, of course, and at that point these became pretty much redundant, and it's little more than a relic of a short-lived period of history where we would literally still be listening for the enemy. When war broke out again in 1939, the War Department sent the Spurn Railway another steam locomotive, another small shunter, the same sort that were around in the First World War, only it was a more modern LNER 040 shunter, this time a Y8 class. Painted up in the War Department's pitch black livery, it became known on the Spurn Peninsula as the Black Sapper. The problem is, this time round, there was nobody here who knew how to operate a steam locomotive. The chief engineer here had run one of the steam pumps on Bull Sands Fort out in the Humber, but not actually a steam locomotive. And whilst he managed to get steam up, it was only sufficient to kind of move the loco a few metres down the track, before which it would run out of steam. In a panic, they put out a cry for help across the peninsula, asking anybody if anyone had any experience with a steam locomotive. And this being the 1930s, 40s, there was at least one soldier who had been a railwayman. And when they got him up on the footplate and he opened up the firebox, the story goes that he almost passed out laughing from what he saw in there. Once he'd recovered from this fit of amusement, he did actually spend a couple of days showing the engineers how to set the fires, how to rake them over, how to drain them and clean them and prepare them for work in the morning. And once he'd showed them this, the engineers had absolutely no problem, and Black Sapper gave absolutely sterling performance until it was finally shipped away back to the dairy coats at the end of the war.
Perhaps the biggest contribution of World War II to the landscape at Spurn was the concrete roadway that was laid by the War Department. After the war ended, the concrete roadway proved its worth as a way of moving things to and from the point, and the batteries were dismantled. The grim reality set in that the railway probably would never really be needed again, and the War Department began dismantling it in 1951. Shipping the rails out for use elsewhere and demolishing buildings such as the workshop. Sadly, the wider community that had grown here for hundreds of years also began to shrink. Lifeboat crews no longer needed to be as large due to advances in the boats they were using, so there were fewer families needing to live here. The cottages inside the old wall that had once been built to protect the old lighthouse before this one were also demolished, one by a mine dropped from a German aircraft, the rest by locals. And the protective wall too disappeared as lighthouses no longer needed a community of lighthouse keepers to run them. The lifeboat inn and the school went the same way. But other than the lighthouse and the lifeboat operators' buildings, there's little else here these days other than the ruins of Green Battery on the very tip of Spurn. The concrete road laid down by the War Department in the early 40s is still here, apart from a stretch that was destroyed in the storm surge of 2013, which levelled a lengthy stretch of Spurn's neck, cutting the rest of it off from the mainland at high tide. Here and there is what's left of the road, and you can still see the places where the railway crossed it. The rails still here, embedded in the concrete. And at the bottom, the old pier, reinforced in the 1930s, still stands, locked off from the public, the last major reminder of the railway that once ran to the end of the earth.